My son and his wife thought I was just a confused old woman they could trick into signing away the ranch I'd built my entire life. They started treating me like a child, isolating me, and planning to throw me in a home, all to sell everything and pay off their massive debts. But they made one critical mistake. They forgot who they were dealing with. And the lesson I taught them in that bank conference room was colder and more final than they ever could have imagined. The crisp autumn air always felt like a promise out here, a quiet settling of accounts before the deep sleep of winter. Jim and I had built this ranch on that same principle: hard work, honest accounts, and a respect for the seasons of life. My son Michael and his wife Vanessa, they operated on a different calendar. They arrived from Denver in a cloud of dust, kicked up by a car so sleek and silent it looked like a polished river stone, a stark intrusion on the gravel road Jim and I had laid by hand 50 years ago. They filled my quiet kitchen with a noise that wasn't conversation, but performance. It was a loud recitation of their lives: ski trips to Aspen, a new gallery opening downtown, the frankly ridiculous features of their new Tesla. I just listened, nursing my coffee, and watched them. I saw the way Vanessa's smile was a carefully held position, a strained muscle that never reached the cold panic in her eyes. And I saw Michael, my son, constantly palming his phone, his thumb swiping at the screen with a nervous energy whenever he thought my gaze was fixed on the distant mountains. They spoke of abundance, but they reeked of desperation. The next day, their campaign began. They called it caring, but it felt like colonization. Michael presented me with a new phone, a hideous gray plastic brick with buttons the size of quarters. My old phone, he explained with a patient, condescending tone, was just too complicated for me now. I didn't argue. Later, when my neighbor Bill called to see if I needed help clearing a fallen branch near the fence line, it was Vanessa who answered. I heard her tell him, in a voice dripping with saccharine concern, that I was resting and shouldn't be bothered, but she would pass along the message. She never did. They were building a wall around me, brick by loving brick, framing my isolation as an act of protection. They wanted to shield me from the stresses of my own life, a life I had managed perfectly well for 72 years. The performance reached its finale on Sunday evening, just before they were set to leave. Michael placed a thick, glossy folder on my worn kitchen table, its sharp corners and slick paper an affront to the scarred, familiar wood. He told me they were just some estate planning documents from their lawyer, something to make sure I was taken care of. His voice was smooth, reassuring, the voice he used when he wanted something. He flipped through the pages so quickly they were just a blur of black and white, stopping at a page flagged with a bright pink sticker. He said it was just a simple medical directive update, a formality. His hand rested on my shoulder, a heavy proprietary weight. I looked at my son's face, searching for the boy I raised, and in that moment of weakness, of wanting to believe in the fiction of his love, I picked up the pen and signed my name. I didn't see that buried in the jargon and fine print was a durable power of attorney, a document that handed him the keys to my entire world. Sleep wouldn't come that night. The house was too quiet. The silence they had created now, a humming, oppressive thing. I got up for a glass of water, my bare feet cold on the wooden floorboards. As I passed the guest room, I heard a voice, Vanessa's, but stripped of all its practiced sweetness. It was a sharp, frantic whisper, a sound like tearing metal. I stopped pressing myself into the shadows of the hallway. I heard the words clearly, each one a nail in the coffin of my denial. The forbearance ends in 30 days, Michael. 30 days until the bank posts the foreclosure notice for everyone to see. Did she sign the papers or not? Was it done? I stood there, frozen in the dark, the glass cold in my hand. The air left my lungs in a single silent gasp. It wasn't a wall they had been building around me, it was a cage, and I had just watched my own son lock the door. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. That night's sleep was a stranger. The shock didn't fade into grief. It hardened into something cold and solid in my gut. It hardened into a plan. When the sun rose, I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a strategist. I made myself small, shuffling into the kitchen with a tremor in my hand that wasn't entirely faked. I let my eyes seem a little distant, a little unfocused. They saw exactly what they wanted to see: a confused old woman, an obstacle that was getting easier to move. As Vanessa sat there sipping her coffee, with the smug air of a predator who thinks the hunt is over, I looked at her with what I hoped passed for innocent curiosity. I asked her about that fancy Denver lawyer of theirs, wondering aloud if he was the same one who helped some folks I knew, the Davidsons, with their foreclosure a few years back. I said I heard he was terribly expensive but very discreet. Of course there were no Davidsons, but the word I chose, foreclosure, I let it hang in the quiet morning air like a gunshot. The effect was instantaneous. Vanessa choked coffee, sputtering from her lips. Her carefully constructed composure didn't just crack, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. Michael came rushing in from the other room, his face a mask of alarm. And then the lies started, clumsy and desperate and tripping over each other. He insisted the lawyer was a renowned estate planner, while she stammered that she'd never heard of any Davidsons. Their shared panic was a symphony of guilt. It was the moment I knew for sure. They weren't just greedy, they were desperate. And they were amateurs. That was the first mistake they made, thinking the cage they built was for a lamb when it was for a wolf. Later that day, they announced they needed to run a few errands for me in town, a lie so thin it was transparent. The moment their car disappeared down the long gravel drive, I moved. I didn't shuffle. I walked with purpose out to the barn, the smell of hay and old leather filling my lungs. In a dusty crate in the back of the tack room was a relic, a heavy black rotary phone, a private line Jim had kept for business. It was still connected. My fingers, steady and sure, dialed a number I knew by heart. When he answered, I didn't waste a single word. I told him, "Frank, it's Margaret Lee." I took a breath and let the steel into my voice. "Jim's paper is armor, time has come. I need you." There was a pause on the other end, and then the gruff, steady voice of my husband's oldest friend, a retired bulldog of a lawyer, simply said, "On my way." They came back a few hours later, and the panic was gone, replaced by something uglier, a grim resolve. They didn't bother with the pretense of gentle concern anymore. They stood together in my living room, a united front of deceit, and announced they had scheduled a tour at a place called The Willows, a premier assisted living facility in Denver, for the following week. My son couldn't even look at me when he said it was time, that they just couldn't risk me being out here all alone anymore. The threat was no longer veiled. The timeline had just been violently accelerated, and I knew my next move had to be just as swift and 100 times smarter. When faced with an ultimatum, you have two choices. You can meet it with force, or you can let your opponent think they've won. I chose the latter. I let my shoulders slump, leaned a little heavier on my cane, and gave a long, weary sigh that I hoped sounded like defeat. I told them, "Whatever you think is best, dear." It was a performance worthy of a stage, and they were a captivated audience. I watched the triumphant relief wash over their faces, the shared glance that said, "It's over. We've won." They believed my brief spark of defiance had been nothing more than a flicker of an old fire now properly extinguished. And just like that, they were back in control, which was exactly where I needed them to believe they were. They left the next day, promising to return in a week to take me on the tour of my new cage. I didn't have to see their sterile, oversized house in that Denver suburb to know what it looked like. I could picture it perfectly. I could see the mountain of mail on the granite countertop, unopened bills, stamped with angry red letters past due, final notice. I could see Vanessa, her face tight with envy, scrolling through pictures on her phone of friends on vacation in Tuscany, that bitterness curdling inside her because the life she felt she deserved was slipping through her fingers. And I could see my son Michael in his glass-walled home office, his voice stripped of all authority, pleading with some faceless stranger from a credit card company. I didn't need to see it, because I had heard it all in that one panicked whisper in the night. Their life wasn't a fortress of success. It was a house of cards, and the slightest breeze was about to bring it all down. The moment their car was a speck of dust on the horizon, I went to work. I didn't rest. I went into Jim's office, a room that still smelled faintly of him, of leather and pipe tobacco, and quiet strength. I knelt down and opened the old fireproof strongbox, hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside was the heart of this ranch, the story of our lives written on paper. There were the original deeds, the brittle paper tracing back generations. There were the water rights certificates, more valuable than gold in this part of the country. And there were Jim's ledgers, page after page, of his meticulous handwriting, recording every calf born, every fence mended, every dollar earned and saved. This was our legacy. This was my armor. I took out an old digital camera, and for the next 5 hours, I methodically photographed every single page, every document, creating a digital fortress. A few days later, my arrogant, swollen son made his critical error. Believing me to be completely docile and defeated, he used the kitchen phone, my phone in my house, to call a high-end Denver realtor, one of Vanessa's friends. He spoke in a low, conspiratorial voice, scheduling what he called a discreet, preliminary appraisal of the ranch. He was so confident, so sure of his victory, that he didn't even notice me sitting in the adjoining living room, a book open in my lap. He didn't see me quietly write down the realtor's name and number in the small notebook I always kept in my apron pocket. It was a habit Jim had taught me decades ago. Listen more than you talk, and always, always write it down. My son was planning to sell my life out from under me, and he had just handed me the name of his auctioneer. The morning they were supposed to take me to see my future prison was bright and cold. They were impatient, their polished city shoes tapping on my dusty porch boards, their anxiety a frantic hum in the quiet air. I moved slowly, deliberately, making them wait. I was still playing the part of the frail, confused woman they thought they had conquered. Just as Michael opened his mouth to tell me to hurry, a sound cut through the morning stillness, the crunch of tires on gravel. It wasn't their silent electric car. It was the sound of a real truck, one that had seen its share of work. A dusty old Ford pickup rolled up the drive, and a man got out who was a living relic of my husband's world. It was Frank, clad in worn denim and scuffed leather boots, a stark contrast to my son's tailored Denver life. He wasn't carrying a weapon, but the worn leather briefcase in his hand radiated more menace than a loaded gun. He walked right past me, straight to Michael, and handed him a set of papers. I watched my son's face go from arrogant impatience to confused disbelief as he read them. Frank's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as he informed Michael that he was serving him a cease and desist letter and a legally filed revocation of power of attorney. He finished by telling him his authority over me and my assets had been terminated effective immediately. That legal document was the pin that punctured the fragile balloon of my son's composure. He didn't just deflate, he completely fell apart. The years of carefully hidden financial anxiety, the deep shame of his failures, the sheer terror of being exposed. It all came pouring out of him in a torrent of pathetic sobs and desperate confessions right there in my front yard. He admitted everything: the crippling debt from a life they couldn't afford, the second mortgage on their house, the desperate, half-baked plan to sell my ranch to save themselves from ruin. He wailed that they were going to lose everything, as if that was some kind of justification for trying to steal my life. Vanessa, seeing their golden parachute go up in flames, didn't rush to comfort her crumbling husband. She turned on him with a venomous fury that was startling to watch. She called him a weak, pathetic man who couldn't even handle one old woman. Their united front, the carefully crafted image of a power couple, shattered into 1,000 ugly pieces. They stood there, two strangers united only by their greed, now tearing each other apart over the scraps of their failed conspiracy. I had watched the entire breakdown from the porch, silent and still. Now I stepped forward. The cane I had been leaning on was now held loosely in my hand, no longer a prop for a frail woman, but a staff of authority. My feigned confusion was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable power that I hadn't felt in years. My voice when I spoke was calm and cold and carried across the yard with absolute finality. I told them both to get off my property. Michael stammered, his face a mess of tears and confusion, and asked what I was going to do. I looked at my son, at the man he had become, and I felt the last thread of our bond sever. I told him I was going to honor his father's legacy, something he knew absolutely nothing about. Honoring my husband's legacy wasn't about revenge, it was about balance. Jim believed in fair accounts and firm boundaries, and the books on my son's life were dangerously unbalanced. A week after I sent them away, Frank summoned Michael and Vanessa to a meeting. Not in his dusty office, but in their world, a sterile, glass-walled conference room at the Denver bank that held their mortgage. When they walked in, looking nervous and confused, they found me and Frank already seated. And with us was the bank's senior vice president, a man named Henderson, who had managed my family's pristine accounts for 20 years. The look of dread that washed over my son's face was the beginning of the reckoning. I didn't say a word. I let Frank orchestrate it. He wasn't there to talk about betrayal or broken hearts. He was there to talk about transactions. With the cold precision of a surgeon, he laid out the facts. He presented a set of closing documents, pushing them across the polished table. He explained that the Lee Ranch had been sold 2 days prior to a neighboring agricultural conglomerate, one of the oldest ranching families in the state. I watched their eyes scan the papers, saw the moment their minds registered the sale price. I saw the twin gasps as the number, a sum far greater than they had ever imagined, settled in. And in the same instant, the hope in their eyes died, replaced by the hollow look of finality. The golden goose was gone forever. But the true judgment didn't come from me or from the legal documents. It came from Mr. Henderson, the gatekeeper of the world they so desperately wanted to belong to. He looked at Michael and Vanessa, his defaulting delinquent clients who were just days from public foreclosure. Then he looked at me, his long-standing honorable one. His expression was a quiet, devastating mixture of professional contempt and profound disappointment. There was no shouting, no public shaming. There was only the silent, damning verdict of the one institution they truly respected. In that moment, in that room, they weren't just broke. They were disgraced. They were ruined in the one place that mattered most to them. Frank then slid a final document across the table. It was a bank confirmation, a single sheet of paper showing that their second mortgage had been paid in full. Frank stated in his flat courtroom voice that I had settled their most pressing debt. He went on to explain that the remainder of the proceeds from the ranch sale had been placed into an ironclad, irrevocable trust designated solely for my lifetime care. The house they lived in, the gilded cage they had built for themselves, was now theirs, free and clear. That was the entirety of their inheritance. Then, for the first and only time in that meeting, I spoke. My voice was quiet, but it filled the sterile room with the weight of a lifetime. I told them their father always said, "You give a man a hand up, not a handout." "Consider this your hand up," I said, looking directly at my son. "Do not ask for another." After we left the bank, Frank drove me home. I didn't feel triumphant, just settled. The accounts were balanced. I thought about Michael and Vanessa left behind in that cold glass room. I could picture their pristine, silent house in Denver, a place that was now officially theirs but felt, I imagined, more like a tomb. The crushing terror of foreclosure was gone, but I knew what had replaced it would be a vast, hollow emptiness. They had been saved from ruin, but stripped of their grand ambition. They were left with nothing but the rest of their lives to live with the choices they had made and the legacy they had been so willing to burn for nothing. A few weeks later, I heard the answering machine click on. I didn't get up. I just listened to the silence, and then a single broken word came through the speaker. My son's voice, thick with a shame so heavy it was almost unrecognizable. "Mom." Then a click. That was all. I knew in my gut what was happening in their house. I could see Vanessa bitter and resentful selling her fancy car, her ambition now a sharp, desperate thing, as she tried to claw her way back into the social standing she'd lost. And I could see Michael, a changed man, haunted by that final cold look I gave him in the yard. That one word on my machine wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was the sound of a man hitting rock bottom. I erased the message. I, on the other hand, was thriving. Selling the ranch didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a liberation. As part of the deal, I had Frank negotiate a lifetime lease on the original homestead and the 10 acres surrounding it. It was manageable, it was peaceful, and it was still my home. The vastness that had become a burden was now just a beautiful view, managed by a neighbor who respected the land as much as I did. This morning, I sat on my porch sharing coffee with Frank and the new owner, a man whose family had ranched this valley for a century. We laughed, the sound carrying on the clean, cold air. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of absolute peace. My independence was secure. My future was my own. That evening, as the sun set and painted the vast Colorado plains in strokes of orange and purple, I found myself in Jim's old office. I ran my hand over the worn leather of his chair and pulled an old ledger from the bookshelf. I opened it to the first page. There, in my husband's strong, clear handwriting, was a single entry from decades ago, from the year we started it all. It didn't list the land or the cattle or the equipment. It just said, "Asset number 1, Margaret Lee." I traced the words with my finger, a quiet, satisfied smile spreading across my face. I was home. I was free. Paper had been my armor and self-reliance. I now understood was the only victory that truly mattered. In the end, the quiet reckoning was never about the money. Michael and Vanessa were saved from financial ruin, but were left with an inheritance of emptiness. They had been given a house, but they had lost a home, a history, and the very legacy they so desperately sought to claim. They failed to understand that a true inheritance isn't something you can liquidate. It's a code you live by. For Margaret, the real legacy was never the sprawling land itself, but the self-reliance it demanded. By letting the ranch go, she held onto the only asset that truly mattered, herself.